From the moment the Estates General was called in 1789, delegates spoke of regenerating the French people. This term had come from Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau. Philosophers contended that societies abided by natural laws, and these natural laws governed all human societies. In their opinion, a society either progressed or it degenerated into barbarism, and for many, it appeared that French society had entered a period of decline. Even before the revolution erupted, reformers under the monarchy had spoken of regenerating the country. In order to do this, the government would have to be reformed, effectively restructuring the monarchy and state and setting them on a solid foundation once again. Yet for others, the idea of regenerating France possessed more far-reaching consequences. The delegates sitting in the Estates General insisted that a century of absolutism had degraded the French people, morally and socially. They had become habituated to servitude and obedience under the rule of oppressive kings. These qualities were hardly the mark of a virtuous people, and correcting them required drastic restructuring. This challenge, they believed, was central to the revolution unfolding in the country. In essence, delegates did not seek a return to a golden age or a perfect past. Revolution was intended to revive both people and country. It would mold the provinces and mass of peasants into a new people and create a new and vigorous type of society. This desire for a new beginning increasingly became a central idea of the revolutionary program as the revolution continued. The revolution was intended to transform a divided mass of individuals and social groups into a single and unified people, what theorists were now calling a nation. In short, revolution expressed an idea that the French people could be made anew, and a new society born from the ruins of the absolutist state. This conception would underpin a key theme in the unfolding of the French Revolution. It was not conceptualized as a return to a golden age. Rather, it was to be a process of radical transformation. And it was these ideas that gained popularity as Louis and his family were carted back to Paris as prisoners of the nation. The monarchies of Europe watched cautiously as these events unfolded in France. Not only was Louis XVI a distant relative of the Austrian Habsburg Emperor, he was also a symbol of royal absolutism throughout Europe. In a broad sense, the fate of the king held importance for the fate of absolutism on the whole. Upon learning of the king's capture, Austrian and Prussian representatives met in the German city of Pillnitz, and there issued a public declaration to the revolutionaries. If the royal family was harmed or molested in any way, they warned, it would be considered a cause for military intervention. Back in Paris, radicals quickly turned this declaration to their advantage. It substantiated their claims of royalist plots, they argued. The crowns of Europe were clearly flirting with the idea of invading France and restoring the king to the throne. Rather than waiting for the inevitable, radicals built upon these fears and called for a preemptive strike against conservative forces. In April of 1792, the revolutionary government declared war on Austria and endeavored to rally the country around a patriotic military campaign. Frenchmen were instructed to fight for their country and defend the values of liberty and equality against royal absolutism. Traditionally, the majority of the military command had been drawn from the nobility. But the nobility was now fleeing the country. The army raised by the government was therefore hardly a professional one, and at first it performed quite poorly. A series of blunders and defeats in Western Germany that spring and summer brought Austrian forces right up to the French border. By late 1792, it suddenly looked as though the nation might be invaded and the revolution suppressed. The threat of invasion sent a wave of fear through the country, and these circumstances empowered a new group of men rising to predominance in the country. These were radical Republicans, and unlike the more moderate deputies sitting in the National Assembly, they were skilled at delivering energetic speeches and courting public opinion. They set up political clubs and made dramatic appeals to the people in public, thriving in the new ambiance of debate and democratic politics created after 1789. These radicals called themselves Jacobins, named after the old Parisian monastery in which they held their meetings on the Rue Jacob. Not all Republicans were as fiery and brusque as the radical Jacobins. Other Democrats, grouped together under the title of the Girondins, formed a political faction within the movement that attracted men hailing from the southwestern department bearing their name. While the Girondins were no fan of king or royal government, they resisted the more radical rhetoric and policies of their Jacobin cohorts. To them, the radicals appeared like mad dogs, enragés as they like to call them, men on a mission who seemed to throw reason and pragmatism to the wind for the sake of an angry politic. Leading this radical faction was Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer who had become active in politics with the outbreak of the Revolution in France. An avid reader of Roman history and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Robespierre stressed the idea of public politics and the virtuous citizen, believing that political men should be ardent patriots capable of animating the people and defending the natural rights that belong to all. He was an antagonistic critic of wealth and fond of labeling all property owners in the countryside, whether rich or of moderate wealth, aristocrats, who, by their very nature, were enemies of the people. Following Robespierre was the young Louis de Saint-Just. Only 21 when the revolution began, Saint-Just had initially entertained aspirations of being a poet. In his poetry, he commonly addressed political themes, often condemning modern society for the inequalities in wealth and power it seemed to produce. As his poems and stories tended to sell poorly, he turned his attention instead to politics. In time, Saint-Just would become popularly associated with the radical wing of the Jacobins and see through some of the most atrocious and violent acts of the revolution, earning him the nickname the Angel of Death. The lawyer Georges Danton was another patriotic Republican who came to the forefront of political life with the revolution. His despise for royal government had made him one of the key spokesmen against the king and Bourbon family, and his ability to organize crowds made him a valuable ally to the radicals. It was Danton who was among the first to accuse the royal family of treachery, and following the king's flight and capture, it was Danton who mobilized crowds in support of jailing the king and overthrowing the entire dynasty in place of a republic run by the people. There was also Jean-Paul Marat. With the outbreak of revolution, Marat had turned his attention to sensationalist and fiery political journalism. The scandalous and at times completely fabricated attacks he ran on other politicians in his paper L'Ami du Peuple had made him suspect in the eyes of many government officials. Fearing that he might be arrested, Marat had gone into hiding, taking refuge in the Paris sewers, which exacerbated a cutaneous skin disease that would plague him for the rest of his life. As the French army suffered a series of defeats on the battlefield, these radical voices began pressing the National Assembly to begin rounding up any individual suspected of being a spy or counter-revolutionary agent in the country. Some leaders in the local Parisian municipal government began forming their own militias to hunt down suspected traitors. The Assembly hardly condoned this behavior, but it was powerless to stop it. Members of the nobility and clergy were imprisoned on the merest suspicion of treason, and soon enough, jails began to overflow with these suspected traitors. The question of what to do with these prisoners was never entirely clear. A series of long debates ensued, as political representatives argued over whether trials should be held and what procedures should be followed in determining guilt. For some, this talk and debate appeared too slow. The enemy was advancing, and those detained were clearly guilty in their eyes. And so as the government debated, more militant radicals decided they would take action. On September 2nd, 1792, an armed group of workers and local radical leaders broke into the major prisons, seized the detained suspects, and summarily executed them in the courtyards. The September Massacres, as the event was dubbed, amounted to some 1,400 deaths, the majority of them priests and nobles arrested on the flimsiest charges. These massacres soon spread outside the capital, as radicals encouraged citizens to root out suspected counter-revolutionaries and defeat the enemy within that threatened democracy. Urban laborers and working-class groups organized militias and carried out atrocities against supposed political enemies. These sans-culottes, so-called because they did not wear the fashionable silk pants worn by more well-off members of society, were die-hard radicals, enragés with a grudge against anyone possessing wealth and social status. These militias were veritable nurseries for the extremism and militancy touted by Jacobin leaders. They provided them with an army of radical laborers and working-class militants calling for unbridled justice and violence against anyone who might subvert the revolution. The question, however, was could the Jacobin leadership control these bands of artisans and workers? This was not clear. Events like the September Massacre suggested that these sans-culottes might prove a volatile force that would act on its own will, leaving questions as to whether the Jacobins could in fact control the popular anger and resentment they were fueling. Shortly after the September Massacres, the Jacobins began drafting a new constitution for the nation, which would provide the political institutions they desired. Resisting royal authority, France was to be a republic, not a constitutional monarchy as had originally been hoped. Befitting this republican form of government, every adult male was given the right to vote, inaugurating universal manhood suffrage and establishing a democracy unlike any that had previously existed. A constitutional convention was to be elected to write the new laws for the country and handle the war effort. Yet when elections returned a majority composed of the Girondins and liberal-minded deputies, radicals refused to accept the results. Insisting that the dire situation called for bold leadership, they purged the convention and filled it with their own supporters. More frightening still, the convention drafted a new constitution and declared France a republic in late 1792, but the body summarily suspended the constitution it had just proclaimed. The threat to democracy was too dangerous in the country, Jacobins insisted. Counter-revolutionaries abounded. The nation needed to be cleansed and citizens educated if liberty was to be defended. Revolutionary government, rather than democracy, was to be the order of the day. Of course, the Jacobins also needed to ensure that they could control their sans-culotte base as well. Free institutions might empower angry workers, and the Jacobins had no intention of being led by the mob. They wanted to lead it. As the radicals understood it, democracy needed to be protected, and this required very undemocratic means to ensure its survival. Terror and virtue, Robespierre proclaimed, were now what was demanded of all good citizens. Terror directed at the revolution's enemies, and the virtue of all patriotic citizens ready and willing to defend the newly created republic from its enemies. True to his declaration, it was decided to bring public enemy number one to trial, namely Louis XVI. Tried in a revolutionary tribunal set up by the Jacobins and found guilty of crimes against the nation, Louis was charged with treason and sentenced to death in January of 1793. Traditionally, the call upon the monarch's death was "The king is dead, long live the king." But on the January morning when Louis was executed before a crowd of his former subjects, the call that rang out was "The king is dead, long live the nation." Having seized control of the government and put the king to death in the name of democratic virtue, radicals were bent on accomplishing a revolutionary mission unparalleled in history, they claimed. Yet for many others, these were worrying signs of things to come. In particular, the Girondins were coming to believe that radicals had gone too far. It was easy to see that Robespierre and his allies were on the verge of setting up a dictatorship. Elected to office, radicals were coming to believe themselves infallible, claiming they were in fact the voice of the people. Robespierre was quickly becoming Rousseau's general will incarnate, as he persistently claimed to speak for the entirety of the nation. Inclined to see enemy plots everywhere, radicals were determined to ensure that the values of the revolution persisted. It was imperative, therefore, to push through the revolution by any means necessary in order to save it. Worse still was not only that the radicalism was becoming infectious, it was encouraging a new extremism on the right, as opponents reacted to the purges and massacres carried out against them. In March, the violent anti-religious campaigns spearheaded by the Jacobins against Catholics and priests drew reprisals from peasants. That spring, a virtual civil war erupted in the region of the Vendée. In these struggles, peasants and Republican nationalists sparred off against one another, committing murder and carrying out horrific atrocities against entire communities as the country descended into anarchy. Taking account of these growing conflicts, the Girondins were now adamant that the working-class radicalism fed by Jacobin firebrands needed to be extinguished and order restored to the country. Meeting in secret, they planned to orchestrate a coup against the radical leadership and break up the lawless revolutionary militias. Yet this attempt to wrest control from the radical leadership resulted in an abysmal failure when the Girondins proved unable to muster the force necessary to unseat their radical adversaries. Once the Jacobins learned of this treachery, they began hunting down anyone associated with the Girondin movement. An open war between Republicans was now added to the chaos, as the Girondins were grouped in the countryside and prepared to lead a campaign against the radicals in Paris. In July of 1793, Jean-Paul Marat was sitting in one of the baths he took regularly to soothe his skin condition when a knock came at the door. Opening it, his servant found a young woman, Charlotte Corday, who reported she had just come from the countryside with information regarding an imminent Girondin plot against the government. She requested an audience with Marat at once. Entering the residence, she sat beside Marat in his bath and began recounting the details of the coming Girondin attack that was about to take place. Yet as she conveyed this information, Corday drew a dagger from her cloak and plunged the weapon into Marat's chest, killing him. A Girondin sympathizer, Corday had shrewdly carried out an assassination on one of the top Jacobin leaders, using Marat's persistent obsession with plots and political intrigue to gain access to his personal quarters. When news of Marat's death circulated, the sans-culottes howled for blood. Events were quickly escalating. The war between Republicans was reaching a fever pitch. The conflict between peasants and nationalists in the Vendée was raging while the French army was fighting against Austrian and Prussian forces. With Marat's assassination and the call for vengeance, the Jacobin leadership feared possibly losing control over their sans-culotte base if nothing was done. And so that July, Robespierre and his entourage established a committee of public safety appointed by the convention. Unsurprisingly, all members of this committee were Jacobin radicals. 12 men, among them Robespierre and Saint-Just, sat on the body and assumed responsibility for weeding out counter-revolutionary conspirators. Armed with a newly created weapon that facilitated mass executions, the guillotine, from April 1793 to July 1794, the Jacobins carried out a vicious reign of terror throughout France against all suspected enemies. In total, the Committee of Public Safety would authorize some 14,000 executions over the next year and murder a total of 25,000 people. In their effort to defend the revolution from its enemies, the committee encouraged patriotic citizens to take up arms against the Austro-Prussian forces battling France in Western Germany. To raise an army, the convention instituted the levée en masse, effectively transforming every citizen into a soldier. Officials made emotional appeals to nationalism and patriotism in mobilizing citizens. They dictated that every Frenchman now had a duty to protect the Republic and spread its ideas across Europe, liberating all oppressed people. This sense of purpose animated support for the war effort and filled citizens with a sense of mission as they took up arms for their country. For the Jacobins, war was an effective means of regenerating the French people and reviving the patriotic virtues latent within them. Protecting the revolution and regenerating the people also meant instilling good values in the citizenry. The worship of God was abolished, cleansing the nation of Christianity and its attachment to the old regime. In 1793, Robespierre went as far as to replace Catholicism with a new cult of reason. Citizens were expected to worship a supreme being, a quasi-mystical spiritual presence that venerated human reason and intellect over religion. Anyone suspected of worshipping Catholicism was arrested on the grounds of being a counter-revolutionary. Jacobins even proclaimed that the revolution was akin to the birth of Christ, marking a new phase in human history. To reflect this, the government instituted a new calendar. The founding of the French Republic, the year 1792, was now designated as Year 1, reinforcing the idea that the revolution symbolized a sharp break with the past. Each of the 12 months were renamed, and 5 extra days added to allow for the worship of human reason and wisdom. For some within Robespierre's inner circle, these new policies of state terror and civic religion appeared to go beyond what most Republicans desired. In particular, the radical Danton was becoming conscious of the turn taken by the revolution and felt Robespierre's power needed to be curbed. To do this, he began reaching out to the sans-culotte base, proposing a set of new policies aimed at improving the economic hardship of the working classes. Social equality, rather than just political equality, needed to be addressed, Danton argued. In this manner, he hoped to draw workers and laborers to a platform of social reform and sideline Robespierre. To this end, Danton proposed passing a law of the maximum, calling for controls on wages and prices throughout the country. The legislation would ensure that goods necessary to live were within the means of common people. Salaries were subject to regulation in order to abolish inequalities between the rich and poor. Anyone suspected of disobeying these new measures was arrested and tried before a revolutionary tribunal, ensuring that they were executed. While these policies were favorable with workers, Robespierre and his allies rightly became suspicious of Danton. They saw that his social policies were attempting to sway the sans-culottes, and so in 1794, Danton was arrested on charges of corruption and brought before a revolutionary tribunal. Fearing that he might appeal to crowds and incite a rebellion against the state, his trial was handled quickly and without fanfare. Brought to the guillotine to which he had condemned so many, Danton was capable of facing the prospect of his own death with some irony. "Show my head to the people," he told his executioner. "It's well worth seeing." The extreme measures taken by the Jacobins, consisting of purges, raising a people's army, and price controls, all proved effective in the short term. The Levée en masse did create a revolutionary army capable of defending the country. By 1794, French forces managed to achieve a series of stunning victories against the foreign armies, signaling a turn in the war that placed Austria and Prussia on the defensive. Moreover, the use of terror dealt harshly with internal enemies and discouraged anyone from protesting against the convention. Policies were implemented quickly and without hesitation, allowing the revolutionary government to meet the immediate demands before it. However, the tactics of the Jacobins served to virtually paralyze French society. The Republic's anti-religious and anti-monarchist stance sharply divided the country, provoking a constant state of internal warfare at home. With war and violence straining French society, the economy plummeted as manufacturers, businessmen, and educators all fled. By late 1794, the military victories achieved by the army had ensured that the revolution would not be suppressed. People began to believe that there was no longer a need for the extreme terror tactics employed by the Jacobins. Many Republicans had begun to understand that Robespierre and the Jacobins were jeopardizing the freedoms and liberty that the revolution had promised, raising questions as to who exactly were the true counter-revolutionaries. In the spring of 1794, Robespierre announced plans to put through a new round of purges, and he began singling out Republicans in the government who might attempt to challenge his power. Fears that a more violent wave of terror was about to be unleashed prompted moderate Republicans to take action, especially those who now feared for their lives. Robespierre had to go, they maintained. Otherwise, the Republic would continue to be plagued by purges, violence, and a failing economy. In the month of Thermidor, June by the standard calendar, various Republicans banded together and plotted to carry out a coup with the intention of removing Robespierre from power. On 9 Thermidor, police charged into the City Hall of Paris in an effort to apprehend the Jacobin leadership. Encountering resistance, shots were exchanged. Already anticipating their fate, some Jacobins turned their pistols on themselves and committed suicide. As the police scoured the room, Robespierre was found on the floor, lying in a pool of his own blood, a bullet having torn through his cheek. Unable to speak, he was carried out of the building by the guards. Saint-Just, unharmed, was escorted out in shackles, his head held high in defiance. Charged by the government as outlaws, the Jacobin leadership was sentenced without trial. The following day, all the prisoners were sentenced to death by guillotine. Ironically, this had been the weapon that Robespierre had used to execute his enemies, and now the guillotine would claim him as well. Just before accepting his fate with his normal air of detachment, the young Saint-Just caught a glimpse of the Constitution of 1793 hanging on the wall. He pointed to it. "I'm the one who made that," he said, before his head was placed in the stock of the guillotine and the blade released.